The morning sun streamed through the blinds of Keanu Reeves's modest hotel room in New York City. He sat quietly sipping green tea while reading through the script for his next film project. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the peaceful silence. He glanced at it with mild curiosity, not expecting any calls this early. The name Mike Chen flashed on the screen, his longtime agent. "Morning, Mike," Keanu said, his voice still carrying the gentle rasp of someone who had been awake for hours but hadn't spoken yet. "Keanu, glad I caught you. Listen, something's come up." Mike's voice had that particular excitement that usually meant an opportunity Keanu might want to decline. The Tonight Show had a last-minute cancellation. "They want you on tonight." Keanu took another sip of his tea, thinking. Public appearances weren't his favorite thing, especially not rushed ones. "I don't know, Mike. I'm here to finish prep for the film, not to do press." "We agreed on that." I know, Mike said quickly. "But this is different. They specifically mentioned they want to talk about your charity work. Maybe touch on some current events, including your thoughts on the new pope, Robert Prevost. Apparently, their researchers heard you had some interesting perspectives on his selection." Keanu paused, surprised. He had indeed been following the news about Cardinal Prevost's selection as pope with unusual interest, though he couldn't remember mentioning this to anyone. The topic touched on some personal thoughts he'd been contemplating lately about faith, connection, and finding meaning. How would they know that? Keanu asked, genuinely puzzled. "Remember that dinner at Tom's place last month? You had that conversation with the journalist from the New Yorker. Nothing was on the record, but word gets around. Look, you don't have to do it, but I thought it was interesting they specifically wanted your take on this." Keanu stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling city below. He wasn't one for impulsive decisions, especially when it came to live television. Yet something about this request felt different. He had been keeping his thoughts about Pope Prevost to himself, but perhaps there was value in sharing them. "When would they need me there?" he asked finally. "That's the thing, 4 p.m. for prep. Show starts at 7. Mike waited through the silence. "I told them it was short notice. No hard feelings if you pass." Another pause, then Keanu said, "Tell them I'll do it, but make it clear I won't be promoting anything. This is just a conversation. Will do. They'll be thrilled. I'll text you the details." Mike hung up, likely already dialing the show's producers. Keanu set his phone down and looked back at the script on the table. His schedule for the day was now completely changed. He felt an unusual nervousness, not about being on television. He'd done that countless times, but about speaking publicly on matters he usually kept private. By afternoon, Keanu arrived at the studio through a side entrance. Avoiding the fans who sometimes gathered hoping to catch a glimpse of guests, he was greeted by Lisa, a production assistant with bright eyes and an enthusiasm that somehow didn't feel forced. "Mr. Reeves, thank you so much for coming on such short notice. Everyone's so excited," she said, leading him through the winding hallways of the studio. "Please call me Keanu," he replied with a small smile. "Of course. So, Keanu, we have about an hour for you to get settled in the green room. Then hair and makeup and a brief pre-interview with our segment producer. He'll go over the topics for tonight." Lisa walked quickly as she talked, occasionally glancing back to make sure Keanu was following. "What exactly does the host want to discuss?" Keanu asked as they reached the green room. A comfortably appointed space with snacks, drinks, and a TV showing the studio feed. "Well, they'll start with your current projects, of course, but then they're hoping to get into some deeper topics. Your philosophy on life, your charity work, and yes, your thoughts on Pope Prevost." The host was really intrigued when he heard you had some connection or interest there. Keanu nodded slowly. "I wouldn't say connection, just thoughts." Lisa smiled warmly. "Sometimes those are the most interesting conversations. Raj will be here in about 15 minutes. Can I get you anything while you wait?" "Just water, thanks," he said, settling into one of the plush chairs. When Lisa left, Keanu took a deep breath. He pulled out his phone and began searching for the most recent news about Pope Prevost. He wanted to make sure his information was current. Though he had followed the Vatican announcements closely, it had been a few days since he'd checked for updates. Pope Robert Prevost, an American-born cardinal who had spent significant time in Peru, had been a surprising choice to many Vatican watchers. His selection had broken several traditions, and his first statements as pope had indicated a potential shift in the Church's approach to several contentious issues. His emphasis on environmental stewardship and bridging divides between different faiths had sparked both praise and controversy. As Keanu read, he reflected on why this particular pope had caught his interest. There was something about Prevost's humility and his unconventional path to the papacy that resonated with him. Though Keanu wasn't Catholic himself, he had always been interested in spiritual questions and the ways different faiths addressed the fundamental mysteries of existence. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. A man in his 40s with salt and pepper hair and glasses entered with a tablet in hand. "Keanu, I'm Raj Patel, segment producer. Thank you again for joining us on such short notice." His handshake was firm but not aggressive. "I understand you'd prefer to focus on conversation rather than promotion, which actually works perfectly for what we have in mind for tonight." Keanu nodded. "I appreciate that. I'm just not entirely sure why there's interest in my opinions about the new pope." Raj sat across from him. "To be honest, it was something our host heard through a mutual friend. That you've been following Pope Prevost's selection with particular interest and might have some unique perspectives. We're always looking for unexpected conversations, and this seemed like one that could be genuinely interesting." "I see." Keanu wasn't entirely comfortable with how his private interests had made their way to the show's attention, but he decided not to dwell on it. "What's the format going to be?" "The first segment will be the usual catching up, what you've been working on, some light conversation. Then we'll transition into talking about your philanthropic work, which will naturally lead into discussing larger issues in the world today. That's where we'd bring up Pope Prevost and see where the conversation goes." Raj looked up from his tablet. "Does that sound reasonable?" "Yes, though I should mention I'm no expert on Vatican politics or Catholic theology." Raj smiled. "That's exactly why this is interesting. You're coming at it from a thoughtful observer's perspective, not as an expert or someone with an agenda." After going over a few more details, Keanu was led to hair and makeup, where the team worked quickly and efficiently, respecting his preference for a natural look. As he sat in the chair, he could hear the bustling of the studio preparing for the night's show. The makeup artist, an older woman named Diane with steady hands and a calming presence, worked quietly. "Nervous?" she asked after a while. "Not about being on TV," Keanu answered honestly. "More about speaking on topics I usually keep to myself." Diane nodded understandingly as she applied a light powder to reduce shine. Sometimes those make for the best conversations, the ones that matter. By the time Keanu was ready and waiting backstage, the studio audience was being seated. He could hear their excited chatter through the monitors. The floor director, a young man with a headset and clipboard, gave him a quick briefing on where to enter and where to sit once introduced. "The host will come back and say hello before we start," he explained. "Any questions?" Keanu shook his head. He'd done this many times before, yet tonight felt different. He wasn't here to charm the audience with anecdotes about stunts or to promote a film. He was here to have a conversation about things that mattered to him on a deeper level. True to the floor director's word, the host appeared a few minutes later, greeting Keanu with genuine warmth. "Thanks so much for coming on such short notice. I'm really looking forward to our talk." "Thanks for having me," Keanu replied, shaking his hand. "I hear you were surprised we wanted to discuss Pope Prevost," the host said with a curious smile. Keanu nodded. "It's not usually what comes up in these interviews. That's exactly why I wanted to talk about it. Everyone knows about your films, but I'm more interested in what you think about the world right now. And something tells me you've got thoughts worth hearing." Before Keanu could respond, the floor director signaled that they were nearly ready to begin. The host hurried back to his mark, and Keanu took a deep breath, centering himself. As the show's theme music played and the audience applauded, Keanu felt an unexpected sense of purpose. Whatever happened in the next hour, he decided he would speak honestly, without the usual filters of celebrity interviews. Perhaps that was why he had agreed to come on such short notice. Some part of him was ready to have a different kind of conversation, one that might actually matter. The studio lights were hot and bright as Keanu walked onto the stage. The audience erupted in applause, some people even standing. He gave a small wave, his signature half-smile appearing briefly before he composed himself again. The host greeted him with enthusiasm, shaking his hand warmly as they both took their seats. "It's been a while since we've had you on the show," the host began once the applause died down. Almost 3 years, I think. Keanu nodded. Sounds about right. Time moves quickly. That it does. Last time you were promoting that action film, the one where you jumped off the bridge? The Roosevelt Bridge, Keanu corrected gently. That was quite a stunt. Did most of it myself, but had a great team making sure I didn't actually die. His dry delivery made the audience laugh. The host leaned forward. You've always been known for doing your own stunts. What drives that? Is it the adrenaline rush? Keanu thought for a moment. It's more about authenticity. The camera catches something real when there's actual effort, actual risk involved. Not that I'm trying to get hurt, he added with a slight smile, but there's something about committing fully to a moment that comes through on screen. Committing fully to a moment, the host repeated. That seems like a philosophy you apply beyond stunts. Your performances always have this genuine quality to them. Keanu looked slightly uncomfortable with the praise but nodded. I try. Acting it's about truth in imaginary circumstances, finding something honest even when everything around you is make-believe. The conversation flowed easily as they discussed Keanu's upcoming projects, including a film he was considering directing. The audience hung on his words, laughing at his understated humor and occasional philosophical tangents. After about 10 minutes, the host shifted gears. Now you're known for keeping a pretty low profile despite your fame. But something many people don't know about you is your philanthropy work. You've funded children's hospitals, supported cancer research. Keanu made a small dismissive gesture. I've been fortunate in my life. Sharing that good fortune seems like the natural thing to do. But you don't publicize it. Most celebrities make sure everyone knows when they donate to charity. That would defeat the purpose, wouldn't it? Keanu said softly. It's not about recognition. It's about helping where help is needed. The audience applauded and Keanu looked down, clearly uncomfortable with being praised for something he considered ordinary decency. Speaking of helping where help is needed, the host continued when the applause faded, I understand you've been following the selection of the new pope with particular interest. A flicker of surprise crossed Keanu's face, though he quickly composed himself. Yes, I have. Robert Prevost. Not exactly who the Vatican watchers were expecting. What caught your attention about him? Keanu shifted in his seat, gathering his thoughts. The studio was completely silent, the audience sensing that this wasn't the usual celebrity interview banter. I think what interested me initially was his background, Keanu began carefully. He spent years in Peru, living and working with communities that many in positions of power tend to overlook. There's something about someone who chooses to walk alongside people who are suffering, rather than just talking about them from a distance. The host nodded. He's been called the People's Cardinal because of that work. Yes, and I find that genuine. Not a title he sought out, but one that came from his actions. Keanu paused. There's a consistency between what he says and what he does. That's rare, especially in positions of significant influence or power. You sound like you've given this a lot of thought, the host observed. Keanu smiled slightly. I read a lot. Think a lot. Not always about films. The audience laughed, and Keanu seemed to relax a little. Were you raised Catholic? The host asked. No, not particularly religious in any formal sense. But I've always been interested in the big questions. Why we're here. How we should live. What matters in the end. Keanu's voice had grown more thoughtful, and I respect people who dedicate their lives to those questions regardless of their faith tradition. What about Pope Prevost's stance on interfaith dialogue? He's made some pretty bold statements about working with leaders from other religions. That's exactly what caught my attention, Keanu said, leaning forward slightly. We live in a time where it's easy to focus on differences, to build walls between us and them. But Prevost seems to understand that the challenges we face as a species, climate change, poverty, conflict, they require us to find common ground. The audience was completely still, listening intently as Keanu continued. When I heard him speak about the shared home we all inhabit, it reminded me of something I read years ago about how astronauts often experience a profound shift in perspective when they see Earth from space. They call it the overview effect. All the borders and divisions we create just disappear. And you're left with this understanding that we're all in this together on this beautiful blue marble. That's quite poetic, the host said, seeming genuinely moved. Keanu shrugged slightly. Not my words. But the sentiment resonates, And I think that's what Prevost is trying to communicate in his way. The host took a moment before asking his next question. There's been some controversy about his statements on environmental stewardship. Some have called it too political for a religious leader. Is caring for the planet we all share political? Keanu asked, not confrontationally but with genuine curiosity. Or is it just common sense? Future generations will inherit whatever world we leave them. Prevost seems to understand that this isn't just an abstract theological point. It's about real decisions we make today that affect real people tomorrow. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. The cameras caught several people nodding thoughtfully. You speak about these issues with such passion, the host observed. It's not what people typically expect from celebrity interviews. Maybe that's part of the problem, Keanu replied. We've created these artificial categories. Celebrities talk about movies, religious leaders talk about faith, politicians talk about policy. But we're all just people trying to navigate this strange, beautiful life. The big questions belong to everyone. The host smiled. Fair point. Has spirituality always been important to you? Keanu took a moment to consider the question. I wouldn't necessarily use that word. But meaning has always been important to me. Understanding why we're here. How we can ease each other's suffering, how we can find joy in the midst of all the chaos. He paused. I've been through some difficult times in my life, as most people have. Those experiences force you to confront what matters. The host nodded, sensing Keanu's reference to the personal tragedies he had faced, but respectfully not pushing for details. And you see Pope Prevost as someone who's asking those same questions? I see him as someone who's living the answers he's found, which I respect. Whether or not you share his specific beliefs, there's something powerful about a person who truly embodies what they claim to value. The audience applauded again, and this time, Keanu didn't look away. Instead, he seemed to be considering something, weighing a decision in his mind. The host, sensing this, waited rather than moving to the next question. You know, Keanu said finally, there's something about Prevost's story that particularly resonated with me. Something personal that I haven't really talked about publicly before. The host leaned forward, clearly surprised by this turn in the conversation. We'd be honored to hear it if you're comfortable sharing. The studio was completely silent as Keanu took a deep breath. The cameras zoomed in slightly on his face, which held an expression of thoughtful determination. A few years ago, I was going through a period of questioning, I guess you could say. Questioning purpose, direction. I had achieved success by conventional standards, but was feeling disconnected from meaning in my life. During that time, I happened to attend a small philosophy conference in Rome. He smiled slightly at the memory. Not the usual place you'd expect to find an actor, maybe. But I was there anonymously. Just another person interested in big ideas, and one of the speakers was Cardinal Prevost. Though he wasn't Pope then, obviously. The host's eyebrows raised. You actually met him? Not exactly, Keanu clarified. I was in the audience. He was giving a talk about finding purpose through service to others. Not in religious terms, but in deeply human ones. About how connection to others is what gives our lives meaning. Keanu paused, his expression suggesting he was carefully choosing his next words. Something he said that day changed the course of my life in ways I'm still discovering. And when I heard he had been selected as Pope, it felt significant somehow. Like a reminder of that turning point. The host, clearly sensing they were on the verge of an unexpected revelation, leaned forward slightly. What was it that he said? Keanu looked directly into the camera, his eyes reflecting the studio lights and something more. A quiet intensity that held the audience spellbound. He said, "The bridges we build to others are the only monuments that truly matter." And that's when I realized what I needed to do next. The studio remained utterly silent. Even the cameraman stood motionless, transfixed by the unexpected turn in the conversation. The host, normally quick with a follow-up question, simply waited, giving Keanu the space to continue. After hearing Prevost speak that day, Keanu said, his voice quiet but clear, I stayed behind when most people had left. I wrote him a letter, old-fashioned, I know. A small smile crossed his face. I didn't identify myself, just wrote as one person reaching out to another. I asked him about something he'd touched on in his talk, how to reconcile success and material comfort with the suffering that exists in the world. The host nodded encouragingly. Did he write back? That's the surprising part, Keanu said. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten reply. Several pages long. He'd taken the time to really consider my questions, to respond thoughtfully to a complete stranger. What did the letter say? The host asked, clearly intrigued. Keanu looked down briefly, collecting his thoughts. It was personal, but the essence was this. He wrote that prosperity itself isn't the problem, it's disconnection. Disconnection from others, from purpose, from the wider world. He suggested that the antidote to that emptiness some successful people feel isn't giving everything away or living in poverty, but rather building meaningful bridges between your life and the lives of others. Keanu paused, seeming to consider how much to share. Prevost wrote something I've carried with me ever since. He said, the question isn't whether you deserve what you have. The question is, what will you build with it? The audience murmured appreciatively. Even the host seemed moved. That's profound, he said. Did you ever tell him who you were? Keanu shook his head. No, it wasn't necessary. The conversation was human to human, not celebrity to cardinal. That made it real. And did this correspondence continue? We exchanged a few more letters over the following months, each one digging deeper into questions about purpose, meaning, connection. He never knew who I was, but his words, they changed my direction at a time when I needed guidance. The host leaned forward, genuinely curious. How so? What changed for you after this correspondence? Keanu took a deep breath. This was clearly territory he didn't typically discuss in interviews. The cameras caught a brief moment of hesitation in his eyes before he continued. I'd been successful by Hollywood standards, had the career, the recognition, but I was feeling increasingly hollow, I guess you could say. Those letters helped me see that what was missing wasn't more success or more possessions. It was meaningful connection, bridges to other people's lives that went beyond surface interactions. And so what did you do? The host prompted gently. I started small. Established a private foundation to fund cancer research. Keanu looked briefly uncomfortable, not wanting to appear self-congratulatory. My sister had battled leukemia for years, so that cause was close to my heart. The audience applauded softly, many knowing about his sister's long health struggles. But the foundation was just the beginning. Keanu continued when the applause faded. What Prevost helped me understand was that writing checks, while important, wasn't enough to create the kind of connection he was talking about. Money can create distance if it's just handed over without genuine engagement. The host nodded thoughtfully. So how did you move beyond just funding things? I started spending time in the places my foundation was supporting. Not as a celebrity visitor doing a photo op, but just as a person. Sometimes people recognized me, sometimes not. But I'd sit with patients, talk with researchers, listen to families, trying to understand their realities rather than just throwing resources at problems from a distance. That's remarkable, the host said. Most celebrities in your position would have publicists documenting every minute of such visits. Keanu shrugged slightly. That would have defeated the purpose. This wasn't about my image. It was about learning to see people, really see them, instead of just seeing causes or categories. The host seemed to realize they were witnessing a rare moment of genuine openness from a famously private person. And you're sharing this now because of Prevost becoming Pope, Keanu replied simply. It felt like a sign that maybe these ideas, his ideas about building bridges between people, could reach a wider audience now. And maybe my small experience with how his words changed one person's life might be worth sharing. The studio was completely silent again, the audience captivated. There's something else, Keanu said after a moment. Something I've never spoken about publicly. The host's eyebrows raised slightly. Please go ahead. After about a year of this correspondence and the changes I was making in my life, I decided to visit Peru. Prevost had spent years there, working in communities facing extreme poverty and violence. I wanted to see those places for myself, to understand the context that had shaped his thinking. You went to Peru to follow in his footsteps? The host asked, clearly surprised. Not exactly. More to understand the source of his perspective. I traveled quietly without entourage or publicity, spent time in some of the communities where he had worked. Keanu's face softened at the memory. There was this one village in the mountains, very remote. They'd had a small church where Prevost had served years earlier. The building was half collapsed after an earthquake. The people there spoke of him with such fondness, showed me pictures of him working alongside them to build a medical clinic. How did they react to having Keanu Reeves show up in their village? The host asked with a smile. Keanu laughed softly. Most had no idea who I was. A few younger people recognized me, but even they were more interested in telling me about their community than in my movies. It was refreshing. And what did you learn from this experience? Keanu's expression grew thoughtful again. I learned that Prevost wasn't just talking about connection and bridge building. He had lived it. The people there didn't speak of him as someone who had come to help them, but as someone who had become part of their community, who had shared their struggles and joys. He paused. There was this older woman who showed me a simple wooden cross Prevost had carved by hand for their church. She told me he'd made it from a fallen tree that had nearly crushed her home during a storm. He'd helped clear the debris and then transformed what could have destroyed her into something meaningful. That's a powerful image, the host said quietly. Yes, and it stuck with me. The idea that the obstacles in our path can become bridges if we approach them with the right perspective. The audience was completely still, many leaning forward in their seats. When I returned home, Keanu continued, I wrote to Prevost one last time. I told him about my visit, about the people I'd met, about the cross. I still didn't tell him who I was, but I shared how his example had inspired me to start something new. Which was? The host prompted. Keanu took a deep breath. This was clearly the revelation he had been building toward. I established a network of community centers, places where people from different backgrounds, different faiths, different economic situations could come together. Not charity from the wealthy to the poor, but spaces where everyone has something to contribute and something to receive. I've never heard about these centers, the host said. Surprised. That was intentional, Keanu replied. They don't bear my name. They're not publicized as celebrity projects. They're simply community spaces, each one designed with and by the people who use them. Where are these centers located? They started in Los Angeles and New York. Now there are 17 across the U.S., 5 in Canada, 3 in Peru, and we've recently opened locations in Ukraine, South Africa, and the Philippines. The host's eyes widened. That's extensive. How have you kept this completely private until now? By remembering that it's not about me, Keanu said simply. Each center is run independently by local people. My foundation provides initial funding and ongoing support when needed, but the vision belongs to each community. And what happens at these centers? Keanu's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. Everything. Elderly people teach young children to read. Teenagers learn traditional crafts from immigrant artisans. People share meals, stories, skills. In Los Angeles, there's a garden where formerly homeless individuals grow food alongside corporate executives. In Ukraine, the center has become a place of healing for children traumatized by war. This is remarkable, the host said, shaking his head slightly in amazement. Why are you choosing to share this now after keeping it private for years? Keanu looked directly at the camera again. Because when I heard that Prevost had been chosen as Pope, it felt like an opportunity to amplify his message about building bridges between people. His words changed the direction of my life. Maybe sharing this story will inspire others to find their own ways to create connection. There was a moment of profound silence in the studio before the audience erupted in applause, many rising to their feet. The host, visibly moved, joined the standing ovation. Keanu looked down, seemingly uncomfortable with the attention but also quietly determined to have shared this part of his life. As the applause began to fade, the host turned to him with one more question. Does Pope Prevost know about all of this? About how his words to a stranger shaped this incredible project?
Keanu shook his head.
No. As far as I know, he has no idea that the person who wrote those letters was me, or what came from our correspondence. Until today, that is. The host took a moment to collect himself as the audience settled back into their seats. The energy in the studio had completely transformed. What had begun as a typical celebrity interview had become something profound and unexpected. So Pope Prevost is about to find out through this broadcast that he had this incredible impact on your life, the host asked, still processing the revelation. Keanu nodded. Yes, though I don't know if he'll connect the dots to those letters from years ago. This is extraordinary, the host said, shaking his head slightly. I have to ask, why keep all of this private for so long? Most people in your position would have made these community centers the centerpiece of their public image. Keanu considered the question carefully. I think when something truly matters to you, there's a natural instinct to protect it from becoming a spectacle. These centers aren't about enhancing my reputation. They're about creating genuine human connection. He paused, choosing his words thoughtfully. There's also something Prevost wrote in one of his letters that stayed with me. He said, "True generosity requires a certain anonymity. When we attach our names to our giving, we risk making it about ourselves rather than about others." That's a challenging idea in today's social media world, the host observed. Most charitable giving is very public. It is, Keanu agreed. And I'm not judging that approach. Public giving inspires others, raises awareness for important causes. But for me personally, keeping this work private allowed it to remain pure somehow, untainted by publicity or ego. Can you tell us more about these community centers? What makes them different from other charitable initiatives? Keanu's face brightened with genuine enthusiasm. The core principle is reciprocity. Everyone has something to give. Everyone has something to receive. We deliberately create spaces where people from different backgrounds interact as equals. He leaned forward slightly, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. In traditional charity, there's often an unspoken hierarchy, the giver and the receiver. That creates distance. What we've tried to build are places where that hierarchy dissolves. Can you give an example? The host asked. In our Detroit center, there's a weekly dinner where everyone contributes something. A dish, music, storytelling, helping with setup or cleanup. A former auto executive sits beside a young mother from the shelter down the street. They both belong there equally. The audience listened intently as Keanu continued. In the Philippines, the center became a hub after a typhoon hit the region. People who'd lost everything worked alongside those whose homes were spared. They rebuilt together without distinction between helper and helped. That's when these spaces are at their best, when everyone recognizes their shared humanity. That's beautiful, the host said sincerely. But surely there are practical challenges to maintaining this kind of equality in communities with such different resources. Keanu nodded. Absolutely. We don't pretend that real economic disparities don't exist. Each center has access to resources, housing assistance, job training, medical care. But those services aren't the center's primary purpose. They're supports that allow people to engage as equals despite their different circumstances. And how are these centers funded? The host asked. You mentioned your foundation provides initial support, but are they self-sustaining over time? It varies, Keanu explained. Some have developed social enterprises, businesses that generate revenue while providing employment and training. Others partner with local organizations or receive community donations. My foundation steps in when there are gaps, but the goal is for each center to find its own sustainable path. It sounds like you've created something truly unique, the host said. But I'm curious, what has this work given back to you personally? How has it changed your life beyond what you've given to others? Keanu looked down briefly, considering the question. When he looked up, there was a vulnerability in his expression that caught the cameras and held the audience's attention. It saved me, he said simply. The studio was completely silent. I've experienced loss in my life, he continued quietly. People I loved deeply. And there were times when that grief felt overwhelming, like a dark room with no doors or windows. Many in the audience nodded in understanding, some visibly moved by his candor. These community centers, the people I've met through them, they became my way back to light. Not because they erased the pain, but because they gave me a purpose larger than myself, a reason to keep moving forward. The host, clearly touched, took a moment before asking, Is there a particular memory or moment from these centers that stands out to you? Keanu's expression softened. There are so many, but there's one that I carry with me every day. He shifted in his seat, the memory clearly vivid in his mind. At our first center in Los Angeles, there was an elderly man who came every day. He had been a professor in his home country before fleeing political violence. Here, he couldn't find work in his field, so he cleaned offices at night. During the day, he volunteered at our center, teaching anyone who wanted to learn about literature, history, philosophy. Keanu smiled at the memory. One afternoon, I was visiting anonymously. Baseball cap, sunglasses, the usual disguise. I sat in on his discussion group. They were talking about resilience, about finding meaning in suffering. I didn't say much, just listened. After the session, this professor approached me. I thought he'd recognized me, but instead he said, You seem to be carrying a heavy weight, my friend. And then he shared his own story, the family members he'd lost, the career destroyed, the identity stripped away, but also how he'd rebuilt himself, how he'd found purpose in sharing what he knew with others. Keanu paused, clearly moved by the recollection. He had no idea who I was. He was just one human reaching out to another he perceived was struggling. And in that moment, I understood what Prevost had been trying to tell me all along. That authentic connection, seeing and being seen by another person, is the most powerful healing force we have. The audience was utterly silent, many wiping away tears. Did you ever tell him who you were? The host asked softly. No, Keanu said with a small smile. It wasn't relevant to our connection. He saw me not as a celebrity, but simply as another human being in pain. That was a gift beyond price, the host nodded thoughtfully. After hearing all this, I have to wonder, does your perspective on Pope Prevost's selection feel more significant now? It does, Keanu acknowledged. When I first heard the news, it felt like, I don't know, like a circle completing somehow. The man whose words had helped me find my way was now in a position to reach millions of others who might be searching for meaning, for connection. Do you think his message will change now that he's Pope? Keanu considered this. I hope not. The beauty of Prevost's approach has always been its simplicity. Build bridges, not walls. See the humanity in everyone. Transform obstacles into opportunities for connection. Those aren't Catholic ideas or religious ideas, they're human ideas. And if he's watching this broadcast? The host asked with a smile. If he realizes that those letters he wrote to an anonymous stranger years ago led to all of this. Keanu looked directly at the camera, a gentle sincerity in his gaze. Then I'd simply say thank you. Your words reached someone who needed them, and they've rippled outward in ways you couldn't have imagined. Isn't that the miracle of human connection? We never really know how deeply we touch each other's lives. The audience burst into applause once more, many rising to their feet. The host, visibly moved, joined them. This time Keanu didn't look away from the response. Instead, he seemed to accept it not as personal praise but as affirmation of the ideas he had shared. As the applause began to fade, a production assistant hurried onto the stage and handed the host a note. He read it quickly, his eyebrows rising in surprise. Well, the host said, looking up with an expression of amazement. It seems your story has already started to have an impact. We've just received word that the Vatican press office has issued a statement. They say Pope Prevost is watching this broadcast and has asked for a way to contact you directly. Keanu's eyes widened slightly, a mix of surprise and quiet emotion crossing his face. It appears, the host continued, that he remembers those letters very well. The studio erupted in excited murmurs. Keanu sat very still, processing this unexpected turn of events. The host, sensing the moment's significance, gently placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder. Are you all right? He asked quietly, temporarily setting aside his role as interviewer. Keanu nodded, collecting himself. Yes, just surprised. I never imagined he'd remember those letters, let alone be watching this. The host turned back to the audience. For those just joining us, we're experiencing an extraordinary moment. Actor Keanu Reeves has just revealed his years-long private correspondence with Cardinal Robert Prevost, now Pope Prevost, and the worldwide network of community centers it inspired him to build. And now it seems the Pope himself has been watching. The cameras caught Keanu's expression, a mixture of vulnerability and quiet determination. He wasn't someone who sought the spotlight for his personal life, yet he had chosen to share this deeply meaningful story. Would you like to take a moment? The host asked considerately. No, I'm okay, Keanu replied. It's just circles within circles. When I decided to speak about this today, I thought it might reach him eventually, but not quite so immediately. Life has a way of surprising us, the host observed with a smile. Indeed it does, Keanu agreed. A small, reflective smile crossed his face. Actually, that was something Prevost wrote about in one of his letters. How the moments that change our lives often come when we least expect them, like guests arriving at an unusual hour. The production assistant returned, handing another note to the host. He read it and looked up with widened eyes. This is unprecedented, he said. We've received a request from the Vatican Communications Office. Pope Prevost would like to speak with you, Keanu, via video call, right now on our show. A collective gasp went through the audience. Would you be comfortable with that? The host asked, clearly as surprised as everyone else. Keanu took a deep breath, then nodded. Yes, of course. The host turned to address the audience and viewers at home. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a brief break while our team sets up this historic call. Please stay with us for what promises to be an extraordinary moment. As the show went to commercial, the studio burst into activity. Technicians rushed to set up a video link. Producers huddled in urgent conversation, and makeup artists quickly touched up both Keanu and the host. Throughout it all, Keanu sat quietly, seemingly gathering his thoughts for this unexpected reunion. When the cameras rolled again, the host addressed the audience. Welcome back to what has become one of the most remarkable interviews in our show's history. We're about to connect live with Pope Robert Prevost at the Vatican, who has requested to speak directly with our guest, Keanu Reeves. After learning of their past correspondence and its profound impact, he turned to Keanu. How are you feeling right now? Grateful, Keanu said simply. And a little nervous, he added with a small smile. I think that's understandable, the host replied warmly. We're ready whenever you are. Keanu nodded, and the host signaled to the production team. A large screen on the set illuminated, and after a moment of technical adjustment, the image of Pope Prevost appeared. He was seated in a simply furnished office, wearing his white papal vestments but with a warmth and informality to his posture that made him seem approachable, despite his new position. Mr. Reeves, the Pope said with a gentle smile. It seems we have much to talk about. Keanu inclined his head respectfully. Your Holiness, this is unexpected. For both of us, I think, Prevost replied with a warm chuckle. I was having my evening tea when my assistant rushed in, telling me I needed to see an American talk show immediately. Not my usual evening viewing. The audience laughed softly, struck by the Pope's unassuming manner. I must admit, Prevost continued, when I saw you on screen and heard you mention our correspondence, it took me a moment to connect the pieces. Those letters meant a great deal to me as well, though I had no idea they were from Keanu Reeves. They were just from a person trying to find his way, Keanu said quietly. Prevost nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's exactly why they mattered. Not because of who you were, but because of the genuine search within them. He leaned forward slightly, and now I learn that those simple exchanges played a role in creating these remarkable community centers you've built around the world. They did, Keanu acknowledged. Your words about building bridges rather than monuments, they changed my perspective at a time when I needed direction. The Pope's expression was one of humble amazement. God works in mysterious ways. When I wrote those letters, I was simply responding human to human, never imagining their reach. And now to hear about these centers, places of genuine connection across differences, it fills my heart with joy. Would you tell us, Your Holiness, the host interjected respectfully, what you remember about this correspondence? Prevost considered for a moment. I received many letters during my time in Peru and afterward, but this particular exchange stood out because of its depth and sincerity. The writer, Mr. Reeves, though I didn't know that then, was asking questions that went beyond the usual theological inquiries. He was wrestling with how to live meaningfully in a world of both privilege and suffering. Keanu nodded, clearly moved that Prevost remembered their exchange so clearly. What I recall most vividly, the Pope continued, was his final letter describing his visit to the communities in Peru where I had served. His observations were so thoughtful, so attuned to the dignity and resilience of the people there. It wasn't the perspective of a tourist or a charitable donor, but of someone truly seeking to understand another's reality. They taught me a great deal, Keanu said, about finding joy amid hardship, about the strength of community. And now, Prevost said with obvious emotion, to learn that this correspondence inspired such beautiful work in the world. These centers where people connect across their differences, where everyone both gives and receives, it's a powerful reminder of how words cast upon the waters can return as unexpected blessings. The audience was completely silent, witnessing this extraordinary conversation with rapt attention. Mr. Reeves, the Pope said after a moment, would you be willing to tell me more about these centers? Perhaps when the cameras aren't rolling? I believe there might be ways the Church could learn from your approach to building community. Of course, Keanu replied. I'd be honored to share what we've learned. And perhaps, Prevost added with a warm smile, we might even find ways to collaborate. The bridges you're building between people of different backgrounds align beautifully with the vision of unity I hope to foster. The host, sensing the historic nature of this moment, asked, "Your Holiness, what does this unexpected connection mean to you personally?" The Pope's expression grew reflective. "In my new role, it would be easy to become distant from the simple human exchanges that give life its deepest meaning. This reminder, that words shared in genuine dialogue can bear fruit in ways we never imagine. It humbles and inspires me." He looked directly at Keanu. "Sometimes the world sees only the surface of people in the public eye, the actor, the religious leader, but beneath those roles we are all simply human beings trying to find our way toward meaning, toward connection. This unexpected full circle in our story reminds me of that essential truth." Keanu nodded, clearly moved. "The letters you wrote, you signed them simply Robert, not with your title. That meant something to me. It was person to person, not position to position." "As it should be," Prevost replied. "Titles and roles have their place, but true connection happens heart to heart, beyond all the labels we acquire." The host, aware of the show's time constraints but reluctant to end such a meaningful exchange, said gently, "This conversation feels like just the beginning of something significant. Your Holiness, Mr. Reeves, thank you both for sharing this remarkable moment with all of us." Pope Prevost smiled. "Thank you for facilitating this unexpected reunion. Mr. Reeves, I look forward to continuing our conversation." "As do I," Keanu replied with genuine warmth. As the video call ended, the studio remained silent for a moment before erupting in applause. The host turned to Keanu, who appeared thoughtful and moved by the exchange. "I'm not sure we've ever witnessed anything quite like that on television," the host said. "How are you feeling?" Keanu took a deep breath. "Grateful for the unexpected turns life takes, for the connections that shape us in ways we can't predict." "What happens next?" the host asked. "I'm not entirely sure," Keanu said honestly, "but I think something meaningful has begun. Perhaps a new kind of bridge building." The host nodded, then turned to the audience. "What began as a celebrity interview has become something none of us could have anticipated. A powerful reminder that beneath our public roles, our different backgrounds and beliefs, we are all connected by our shared humanity." He turned back to Keanu. "Thank you for sharing this part of your life with us, for showing that fame and success can be channeled into meaningful action without fanfare or public recognition." Keanu nodded, looking slightly uncomfortable with the praise but also at peace with having shared his story. "And to our audience," the host continued, "thank you for witnessing this extraordinary moment. In a world that often seems divided, today we were reminded of the power of genuine connection, of building bridges rather than walls." The camera captured Keanu's thoughtful expression one last time, as the audience rose for a final standing ovation. He wasn't smiling broadly or playing to the cameras. Instead, there was a quiet contentment in his eyes, the look of someone who had taken a risk in sharing something deeply personal and found that it had created an unexpected ripple of connection in the world. As the applause continued, he glanced up at the studio lights, then back at the audience, seeming to take in the full circle of this journey. From private letters exchanged years ago to this very public moment of reconnection and the promise of something new beginning. In that moment, he embodied the very message he had come to share, that the bridges we build to others are, indeed, the only monuments that truly matter.